Yin Tuan was captain of one of the great war junks of the ill-fated invasion fleet that was dispatched by Dragon Emperor Wu of Cathay to conquer and colonize the Southlands. Emperor Wu's invasion was intended to secure the spice trade, motivated by an intense rivalry with Araby. Long before the rest of the fleet sailed to its ultimate doom, however, Yin Tuan's war junk was blown off course by the typhoon that scattered the fleet shortly after it put to sea. His crew sighted land again after almost 10 months at sea. For 2 months they had fed on nothing but poisonous fish, and half the crew were dead, and the rest were ill. Yin Tuan made sail for the land straight away, and his men made camp along the shores of the strange Lustrian coast, and feasted upon its tropical fruits until all were well and strong. During this time, the Cathayans saw none of the inhabitants and had no idea where they were. A party of men ventured inland and returned several days later, having found a huge statue carved in the shape of a lizard man. Yin Tuan ordered everyone to stay near the camp, and then at length he gathered soldiers and sailors, numbering 123 men in all, and discussed what to do. Yin Tuan told the men that he had calculated from his charts and astronomical observations that they were on the other side of the world sphere from Cathay. Many shook their heads in despair. No one was willing to attempt the journey back the way they had come and endure the same perils all over again. Their spirits were raised when he mentioned that because it was known that the Southlands were inhabited by lizard men, known vaguely in Cathay as lizard demons, the statue was proof that they had reached there. If they marched overland, they believed that they would meet up with the fleet, which should by now have landed on the eastern side, and that they would encounter little opposition because the army of the lizard men would have gone eastwards to fight the invaders. After marching for several days, cutting their way through dense jungle and hungrily feeding on wild rice and tree frogs, the expeditioners encountered more lizardmen statues. Soon afterwards they entered a wide clearing and were stunned to see 3 huge stone structures rising up in a stepped formation. These were completely overgrown with vegetation and carved in the likeness of countless heads of lizardmen. They made camp on the platform at the top of the highest edifice for safety. At sunrise on the next day, they were suddenly awoken by a strange sound. The entire jungle seemed to be moving and quivering around them. When the jungle mist cleared, they looked down upon a sea of lizard men filling the entire clearing. They were the colour of jade, with yellow crests, and they were marching in unison. None of them had noticed the Cathayans in their vantage point. Tsu Kuo, a soldier with very keen eyesight, pointed out where they were coming from, a huge square-shaped lake like a vast paddy field on the edge of the clearing. They were making rasping noises, droning like Cathayan chanting monks. There were at least 10,000 of them. Fearing for their safety, the expeditioners hid on top of the platform for the whole day until the sun set. The next day, the clearing was empty. The lizard horde had moved through the jungle without flattening the vegetation, but it was possible to see which way they had gone, so Yin Tuan avoided going the same way. His men marched on eastwards for several days. That was until Lin Po, a good and courageous soldier, reported that they were being followed. Nothing happened until they were clear of dense jungle and had begun wading through a shallow mangrove swamp. As soon as they were in the open, several men at the rear of the column were slain by arrows and javelins thrown by unseen enemies lurking among the tangled mangrove roots. Yin Tuan immediately gave the order to make a defensive formation. Suddenly, hundreds of jade-coloured skinks emerged from the undergrowth, armed with vicious weapons. This time, luckily, their arrows fell harmlessly upon their lacquered tiger shields. The Cathayans replied with their crossbows, slaying several of them before they scurried back to the trees. The jungle fell silent once again. Then a flock of birds suddenly scattered out from the trees, and close on their heels a Kroxigor armed with a huge bronze axe charged towards them. It crashed through the shields and began chopping to the left and right. It took 23 crossbow bolts to fell this mighty lizard warrior, because the thick scales which covered its carcass provided better protection than even the lacquered scale armor worn by the Emperor's bodyguard in Cathay. In the end, they lost many men, because even those who had been slightly wounded by the enemy's arrows had simply died, since these arrows were tipped with a lethal poison. Similar ambushes occurred every time they broke from the cover provided by the trees and had to cross expanses of open marsh. Every day YIN TUAN lost more men. The lizardmen were experts in concealing themselves among the marsh plants and were able to approach dangerously close by keeping most of their bodies underwater. Only their eyes and nostrils were visible, just like crocodiles. Then at close range they would emerge and shoot a hail of well-aimed poisoned arrows. After one skirmish, YIN TUAN noticed a warrior taking something from a fallen comrade and hiding it in his clothing. Seeing the glint of gold, the captain ordered him to show it to him. It was a plaque inscribed with the symbols of the lizardmen. YIN TUAN made him confess at great length that 7 soldiers had taken them from a chamber in one of the buildings in the ruined city. Furious that these men had deceived him and brought misfortune upon his company, YIN TUAN beheaded the remaining 6 himself. Then he had the golden plaques left beside the executed men, and the column marched on. This pacified their assailants, who were only intent on recovering their sacred objects. There were no further ambushes. YIN TUAN was surprised when he reached the sea after only 17 days, having thought it not possible to cross the Southlands in such a short time. Then he realized that it was not the same ocean that divides the Southlands from Cathay. He must have crossed the Isthmus of Orks between Lustria and Nagaroth, unknowingly passing near the Norse colony of Skegi and even nearer to the temple city of Orks. And now he was before the great ocean, of which Cathayan sages knew nothing about. Everyone was in great despair, so he decided to start work on building a new vessel immediately. It took them only 2 weeks to make a very fine and large sampan with a good outrigger and 3 sails of woven reeds. They also made a raft and filled it with fruit and gourds full of fresh water, and then put to sea in one boat and towed the raft behind them. The new ship maintained course towards the east, and they were at sea for several weeks. They had almost eaten all of their fruit, which was now rotten, before they once again sighted land. The prevailing winds and currents carried YIN TUAN far to the south of Ulthuan, and blew him towards the coast of the Southlands, which the party hoped would have been conquered by them. YIN TUAN now had only 73 of a mix of soldiers and sailors remaining in his command. They marched inland once again. The landscape was similar in many ways to Lustria. After hacking their way through the dense jungle, they emerged in a vast area of parched ground, with tall clumps of grass and razor-sharp leaves. In the middle of this expanse, the sharp-eyed Tu Quo spotted a creature flying high above them. It was a pterodon, carrying 2 ochre, red-crested skink riders on its back. The flying creature let out a mournful cry when it saw them, which filled the men with dread and foreboding. YIN TUAN ordered them to shoot at it with their crossbows to bring it down before the riders could fly off and warn the leader of their whereabouts, but unfortunately they did not hit it, and it immediately flew away. The enemy attacked at dusk. They took the Cathayans by surprise, and they could not see to shoot their crossbows. The creatures which attacked them were Saurus warriors that came at them in ranks, armed with spears and shields. They fought savagely, thrusting with their heavy bronze and volcanic glass-tipped spears. The soldiers could not stand against them, and YIN TUAN was struck heavily with a mace from behind and fell unconscious. When he regained his senses, he found himself to be bound hand and foot to a long pole. It was being carried by several of the same Saurus who had overwhelmed his men. Ahead of him he could see the faithful Tu Quo, also tied to a carrying pole. He shouted out to him, and he replied that everyone else was dead. This shouting provoked a skink chief, who seemed to be in charge of the column. This officer was magnificently bedecked in gold bangles and exotic feathers. He brandished his spear and began talking in an unintelligible tongue, so Yin Tuan decided to remain quiet. They endured a terrible journey for several days. Occasionally water was poured into his mouth from a gourd, and what little food he got consisted of bitter-tasting dried grubs, but amazingly they staved off his hunger, and were actually quite nice. Eventually they passed along a paved road between rows of crouching lizardman statues and entered a broad open plaza. There were ruins here, like in the first lizardman city, great edifices rising up in steps. These, though, were far bigger and in better repair. All around there was noise and activity from the gangs of skinks scurrying about on various tasks. Massive blocks of carved stone were being dragged up a vast ramp on one side of a tall stepped building. Croxigors were bearing the strain of the ropes, while the skinks directed the work. In other places, groups of skink priests were engaged in heated debates, accompanied by rows of seated scribes writing on clay plaques. Tzu Kuo and Yin Tuan were taken out of the bright daylight and manacled to the wall of a dank and dark vault, guarded by two saurus. The next day, they were led out and taken up countless steps until they emerged into the dazzling sunlight. They were goaded out onto a platform which was halfway up the side of one of the huge stepped structures. There were guards and dignitaries of the lizardmen on all sides. On the steps above and below were ranks of skinks, beating huge drums in unison. Far below, the plaza was full of a dense mass of lizardmen of all types, arranged, it seemed, in regiments. The steps of the other great buildings were also covered in rank upon rank of lizardmen. All the lizardmen around them suddenly turned and began making obeisance towards the top of the great edifice. High up on the top platform, a palanquin emerged from the darkness of an ornate doorway. On top sat a slan mage priest, a creature never before seen by Cathayans. The gold and jade ornaments that it was wearing glinted like jewels in the sun. By the great respect being shown by all the lizardmen, Yin Tuan took this being to be the king or the high priest of the city. This great one made a gesture, and all the lizardmen ceased their obeisance and began their rasping incantations. Before the prisoners was a deep pit from which rose a foul stench. Tzu Kuo and Yin Tuan were prodded towards its edge as a sacrifice to the Old Ones. Tzu Kuo bravely stood to attention, preparing to meet his ancestors like a true soldier of the Emperor. He kept his composure even as he was hurled into the pit. When Yin Tuan was grabbed by the saurus to meet the same destiny, however, his silk tunic tore and revealed his imperial dragon tattoo on his back, which resembled an archaic image of the god Sotek, giving the skink priests and their slan master a problem to ponder and delaying the sacrifice of Yin Tuan. The ritual was brought to an end, and he was led back down to the vault, whilst they decided what to do. At nightfall, Yin Tuan noticed that the reactions of the saurus were not quite as good during the coolness of the night. They seemed sluggish and tired almost. Summoning all the energy that he had left, he performed a single somersault, and although he was not the best disciple of martial arts, he succeeded in catching hold of the carvings on the edge of the light shaft of the vault. He moved so fast that the lizardmen were not able to stop him, and could only growl below him, jabbing upwards with their spears. Yin Tuan hauled himself out of the shaft, and found himself out in the open at the top of the light shaft, on the lowest step of the temple. He did not waste any time, and ran as fast as he could towards the jungle, with bronze manacles still attached to his hands and legs. He kept going throughout the night, without stopping to rest until he was exhausted. He could hear the war drums of the lizardmen beating the alarm in the distance, and knew that they would be following him. He suddenly came out of the jungle onto the banks of a river. He stumbled along the bank, tugging at logs among the mangrove roots and debris of fallen trees, until he managed to move one. He dragged it into the water and lay on top of it. Soon he was drifting with the current. As he slowly glided off to sleep, he thought that it was very good fortune that the river was flowing eastwards. Suddenly he awoke. His feet were in the water and in excruciating pain, bitten by carnivorous fish. Somehow he managed to stay on top of the log, keeping himself awake until the sun had risen. All day he drifted with the current under the burning sun. He had escaped the lizardmen at last, but it seemed certain that he would die anyway and be eaten by the fish. At length, the log was washed up on a vast sea bank. He dragged himself ashore and slept. The next day, he began to walk across the sandbank until he had reached the far side. The water was a different colour, the colour of the ocean. It tasted salty, but he didn't care as he rejoiced at finally reaching the Sea of Terror at last. He could tell from the sun's position that he was on the northern bank of the river mouth, and so began to walk northwards, reasoning that sooner or later he would reach the fleet of the Emperor anchored off the coast and be rescued. Yin Tuan walked slowly for days, eating shellfish and birds' eggs. He managed to break free of the manacles on his wrists and ankles by bashing them with rocks. As time wore on, he began to see ships' timbers scattered on the sand which had drifted in on the tides. As he proceeded further northwards, he saw the scattered hulks of ships. Soon he recognized them as imperial war junks of Cathay. At first, he thought that these were the other junks which had been scattered and shipwrecked in the typhoon. He found no survivors, only a few bleached bones which had been picked clean by the birds. Yin Tuan sat down in despair. Before him was a terrible sight. The whole beach was full of wrecked junks and strewn with countless bones. It was all that remained of the mighty invincible fleet of Imperial Cathay. Over 1,000 war junks and 100,000 men. He wandered along the wrecks for hours and found no sign of any survivors. The misfortune that befell the fleet had occurred too long ago. He camped on the beach for several days before he saw the sails of a junk out at sea. He lit a fire of old tarred driftwood to signal it. Soon the junk approached close to the shore. It was a trading junk on the spice route to Araby, flying the banner of the Taipings, who were well-known spice traders. They sent out a sampan for him as he waved and shouted from the beach. The crew were surprised to see him and very anxious to be gone from that place as quickly as possible. From them he learned that the Emperor's fleet had been wrecked while at anchor by a second terrible typhoon. The survivors had marched inland and disappeared. The Emperor had therefore ordered all traders to keep watch on the coast for any sign of banners. Yin Tuan was the only survivor of that mighty expedition to be found alive. He returned to Cathay and was received into the presence of the Emperor himself to give his account. The Emperor ordered that it should be recorded for posterity, and rewarded him with the command of the palace guard.
Iridocyclitis.